I'm pretty sure this video was inspired by a comment, but for some reason, I can't seem to find it. So, if you suggested I look at romances, this is that video. Admittedly, romance is not a genre I spend a lot of time with. It's not that I dislike it, but I find it as one of the most difficult genres to try writing in. I know what you're thinking. Excuse me, you dumb fox. A certain greeting card company has a TV channel that is famous for the sheer amount of romantic comedies they release every year. Surely it's one of the easiest genres. How hard can it be to make a story about characters in love? Very. The answer is very. You see, romance's perceived easiness is precisely where its difficulties lie. It's been done countless times, and yet there's very little variation underneath. I'm certain I could open up Trilby right now and write a romantic screenplay just fine. But it would be a genuine issue trying to make it feel original. It's probably the one genre that its most avid fans do not actually want to be surprised by. They want the couple to be together by the end, which means every romantic comedy ends with the couple together, and every romantic tragedy ends with one or both of them dying. If you make something where the couple simply decides not to be together, then I would argue it's no longer a romance and it's actually a coming-of-age story, which can in fact work with characters of any age. My point is, a romance of any variety already has not only its ending predestined, but also the inciting incident and the midpoint as well. I do want to take a minute to dwell on this point. Remember that the main story arc is the A plot and the secondary arc is the B plot. When people talk about a romantic subplot, what they are actually talking about is a romance plot in the B position. I needed to lay it out like that because we are so used to seeing romantic B plots that it can be surprisingly easy to accidentally write a main romantic plotline as if it was secondary. For example, if the relationship is going very well the entire story and the only conflict is found from outside the relationship, that might work for a B plot, but not an A plot. You will have readers wondering what the story is actually about, or worse, accusing the story of falsely advertising itself as a romance when the romantic parts are the least developed. Rather, in a successful romance, the relationship is front and center. It's the protagonistic goal and where all the tension has to pull against. A drama can get away with workplace tension working in the A plot, while a romantic B plot remains mostly unaffected, but in an actual romance, any tension that doesn't involve the relationship is most likely wasted. Granted, it can be indirect. Workplace tension that risks a negative effect on the relationship could very well work, but it does have to affect the relationship at some point. As an example, let's look at Top Gun Maverick again, because I still have the clips from the last video I made. It's not a romance, but it has a romantic B-plot. Maverick's relationship with Penny always moves forwards and is at very little risk from the A-plot messing it up. I mean, sure, Maverick isn't entirely sure he's going to survive the mission, which is technically a risk to the relationship, but my point is that there's never a moment where the viewer is worried they will break up. Once we see her understanding Maverick's pain, we only ever see them get closer together and not farther apart. That only works because it's a B-plot. An actual romance would need to keep consistent tension trying to pull the characters apart, and it's the characters' actions that bring them together in spite of the tension. So the obvious question is, how does one write a good romance? Well, the answer is in execution. Romances pretty much have all their core theory already figured out. What the writer needs to do is execute the theory in as different of a way as they can figure out. My goal today is to explain the mechanics that successful romances tend to utilize so that you can build your details with them in mind. The first and most important part is the characters. Romances will pretty much always follow the arc plot, so this is a genre where character development is the star of the show. Unlike a lot of other story types, where you can make a clear main protagonist, romances need to have two clear protagonists held in a tricky balance. Remember, you want them to want each other, but the world around them is trying to pull them apart. You could do this directly like Romeo and Juliet, but more contemporary writers will usually let internal conflicts do the heavy lifting. Let's say you're writing a romance between Jack and Jill, then both of their X but Y internal conflicts should start as Jack is in love with Jill, but blank, and Jill is in love with Jack, but blank. If you tie those blanks to the world, you can basically double dip. The world is trying to keep them apart, and you can also have strong character participation in that. For example, Jack is in love with Jill, but he's a revolutionary. Jill is in love with Jack, but she's a loyalist. They want to be together, the world is trying to keep them apart, and the characters are involved with both the being together and the pulling apart. It's interesting because it's tense. There is no obvious resolution that the readers or audience would immediately guess, so they will continue their investment in the story to see how everything comes together. Plot-wise, the discussion is very similar. This is one of the only genres where some events need to happen without too much direct protagonistic intervention. That's not to say the protagonists don't have control. I'm just saying that if the relationship is the main function in the story, then some events that seem like stuff that's usually the protagonist's job will have to happen without the protagonist so that they have to react in a way that suits their relationship. I'll make an example. Sticking to that Jack and Jill I designed earlier, it would usually be the case that major battles between the revolutionaries and the loyalists would have the protagonists present as significant agents. But as it is a romance, that's not necessarily the case this time. A major battle can happen in the background because the story isn't about the war, but rather two people's relationship during the war. As such, it is more pressing for the story to cover how the relationship dynamics shift according to world events. Maybe they're on a secret date of some kind and they receive critical information about engagement between the two sides. It's an immediate mood shift, especially if there is death involved. Sure, it's an extreme example, but focus on the principle. The relationship is the focus, not the stuff happening around it. Now, please do not misunderstand. I still think you should have the protagonist doing as much as you can get them to do. I really want to stress that your protagonist shouldn't be in the backseat of their own story. I'm just trying to make sure it's clear that focus management in writing a romance is a crucial task that can be easily overlooked. The plot has to be difficult, dangerous, or otherwise inconvenient for the couple to be together, so that it is more meaningful that they still choose each other. Plus, the story is more interesting when the characters have to really go out of their way to make things happen. Securing the relationship is the overcoming obstacles every story is about. Weak obstacles or no obstacles will ruin a story. The difference is that romances typically have relatively small stakes compared to other genres. Funnily enough, that works in favor of romances than to their detriment. Well-written, small-stake stories are frequently reader and audience favorites because they are much easier to relate to. Of course, that brings us to the next point. Romantic stories have to be relatable to be enjoyable. Even if you're someone as lonely as an animated fox talking on the internet, the good romance should be approachable enough for you to quickly feel for the characters involved. You will notice that even genres such as science fiction and high fantasy have to have some way of making sure the story is relatable in some way, usually by making the character struggles not too far off thematically from everyday people. In other words, the stuff that's on the most display is not familiar to the reader or audience, so the stuff in the background has to be where the relatability comes in. Romances almost have to do the opposite. Someone who's watching a romance has some kind of expectation of what a romantic relationship looks like. So the details have to bear the weight of original storytelling. The settings might be different from what you'd expect in a romance, or the characters' jobs are not romantic, or something else along those lines. For example, a romance between an attractive cafe barista and an equally attractive artist in a picturesque city full of pretty lights and good food is just not going to work anymore. It's too cliché. But a romance between a combat engineer and a plumber at a remote research station could be very interesting. It even ties into my earlier point about the world trying to pull the couple apart. There just doesn't seem to be any inherent disagreements between a barista and an artist, and there's nothing external that would oppose the relationship either. As a result, the methods to pull them apart would seem contrived. With my later example, their jobs could be so demanding that they struggle to see each other, or the research site is so controlling that it doesn't allow fraternization at all. In other words, the more out of the box the situation is, the more headroom the writer gets in regards to creatively building something original. To a certain extent, romances can be one of the easiest genres to accidentally become a sort of wish fulfillment fantasy. As always, please be careful about that. It's not that you can't write something like that, but it's just not a good idea to. Romantic wish fulfillment stories in particular tend to come across as very shallow. The reason is quite simple. Respect. In all stories, you're supposed to respect the characters in their decision-making and actions. Power fantasies, for example, disrespect antagonists by making them straw men in ideology or ability. Romantic wish fulfillment fantasies will objectify one or more of the characters. The obvious example is the extremely attractive female character falling in complete love with an average guy she has spoken to once, but it can go also every other way too. Romances do not work if only one member of the couple has agency. Instead, a romance needs both protagonists in the couple to be equal in their agency. Neither of them are a side character because they are both in the same shared role of protagonist, even if one of them is shown more than the other. The last thing I want to cover are all the overall genre expectations of romantic stories. Romantic comedies and other positive variations are generally going to end with the couple together and life more or less stabilizing around them. Characters are generally going to be happy for the couple, and the characters who are not are considered to be no longer important. For example, if one of the characters had to leave a job to be with their love, the non-understanding boss will be pushed aside at the end. If it's a close relative that didn't approve of the couple, they will either have a change of heart or also just be ignored by the protagonists. Romantic tragedies and other more negative variations will do the opposite. The reader or audience still wants the couple to be together, but for whatever reason it doesn't happen, usually by means of one or both of them dying. This is the one to be extra careful about. Anytime you're writing in a genre where you are not giving the reader or audience what they want, you need to make sure that the overall story sets it up well enough, so that the readers or audience feel the sadness and appreciate the story instead of hating the story. All of that might seem obvious, but I did want to verbalize it. I have seen some writers who decide to throw in a tragic ending for no other reason than they thought a tragic ending makes them seem more mature as a writer. That's just simply not true. A writer seems more mature and or experienced when they have an ending that makes sense for the story. Always write the ending that serves the story. I hope you enjoyed this general look at the romance genre. I'm considering doing similar videos for other genres as well, but we'll see. Also, sorry for being somewhat missing recently. I've had to constantly be traveling, but things are hopefully about to settle down for a bit. Keep writing.